Welcome to Taming Disaster with Drones for Good podcast. Tune in for in-depth interviews, one-of-a-kind perspectives, and insightful conversations with industry leaders who are using drones to help prepare for, respond to, and recover from complex emergencies and major disasters around the world. And now, from the AirXos studios in Miami, Florida, the heart of Hurricane Alley, here is your host, Christopher Todd.
Hey, welcome to another edition of Taming Disaster, Drones for Good. I'm Chris Todd, and it's great to have you here today. I'm super excited about today's guest. Ken Stewart is joining us. Ken was the CEO of GE Aviation, and he recently took a new position with NuAir in New York State, and we're going to learn all about what NuAir is up to and where Ken sees the industry heading. So without further ado, let me welcome Ken. Ken, good morning. Welcome to the show.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us. It's great to catch up with you. I know we've been connecting together at the various conferences, commercial UAV, AUVSI, back before COVID. So it's been kind of a virtual world since then. But it's great to catch up with you here as we start off 2021 and kind of get your assessment on where this unmanned systems industry is heading. But before we do that, I always like to ask the guest to kind of fill us in a little bit about your background and how you got into unmanned aviation and what kind of spurns your desires and strokes your fire about this industry.
Sure. So about, I guess over 4 years ago now, I was at a startup based in Virginia doing, it was the first of its kind where they could distribute spectrum on demand. And we've been, building this out. It was the first platform to ever do that. And I was approached by GE Ventures, and they said, "Hey, we're building this thing called the UTM." And I'm like, "I don't know what a UTM is." And they were like, "Well, it's in the aviation world, this, that, and the other." I'm like, "I'm not an aviation person. You got the wrong guy." And but they were pretty persistent. And I started doing some researching about what UTM was, and I was like, "Wow, this is really analogous to cellular networks. Managing access to spectrums, very similar to managing the nature of managing airspace, just a different regulatory. Instead of working with the FCC for 27 years, I work with the FAA." So after about 8 or 9 months of talking to them, I decided to come on board, which was at the time called GE Beyond. We had come up with the name AirXos, which we'll talk about shortly, hopefully, when we moved from ventures to like a real company when we finally became incorporated. So that's how I got into the space.
That's pretty amazing. And now, did you have a background in aviation at all? Like,
my father was a military pilot, so I loved airplanes, around it my whole life, but did not have a background in aviation. So I was, to say I was drinking from the fire hose day one, especially with the team that we had at GE Aviation, would be an understatement.
Well, I mean, I think that's what's really so exciting too about this industry is you don't necessarily need to have that aviation background. It certainly helps in a lot of cases, but depending on what you're working on or what element of the project or the industry, I mean, tech is just as, if not more important. So that's really my background as well. I mean, I was never a manned aviator. I was a tech guy who kind of got into this.
Yeah, I would say very similar. I was in the cellular space for years and started when we used to carry bag phones. And many of the listeners today probably don't know what a bag phone is, but through that entire evolution, and when I started looking at the space, I said, this is really similar to where wireless was back in the late 90s, early 2000s.
That's a really interesting point because I think, we hear a lot about UTM and, some people, unmanned traffic management, what's that? They're thinking, radio to radio or satellite. But I mean, the cell networks are really going to play a dominant role into this with 5G. I mean, what do you think is the most important element that people kind of miss out on as far as putting these pieces together?
Well, I think, it's analogous to a cell network or wireless infrastructure, but it's not exactly like it. Will certainly rely on components of the cellular network and other wireless components. I mean, at different altitudes, you'll have, different access to different spectrum. I think the challenge of 5G is an azimuth problem, is that most of those radios point towards the earth where people are walking around versus up in the air. But that'll be solved. But I think it's more about that cellular networks or the internet world are all brought together in this federated environment. When you used to go from a Verizon network to an AT&T network, you didn't know that. You just transitioned. Yep. And so all of that capability is essentially what you're going to see in these federated markets of UTM. Multiple USS providers peered together, no different than how you peer together multiple wireless carriers.
So I mean, do you kind of see UTM being based on where there's existing infrastructure for cell networks, or is new infrastructure going to be put in place to accommodate?
So I think it's a combination of both. I think, it's easiest to work where there's already existing infrastructure, that's for sure. And cellular is one component. I think the bigger piece is the detect and avoid capabilities in some of the surveillance systems. Radar systems are way too expensive to deploy all across the United States. Getting some manned aircraft operating in, airspace class G using ADS-B would be great, because that would help facilitate a lot of this in terms of the detect and avoid. But sure, I mean, where you've got coverage, we were doing some operations out in the Permian Basin. There was no wireless coverage out there, and satellite, that's the latency is too long. You can't use it. So I'm sure some other technologies will come up to cover those areas that we don't cover today.
Super interesting. Yeah, it's unmanned traffic management is really, I think, the key to unlocking kind of the next evolution of this. We'd all agree. I mean, you hear a lot of talk now about remote ID and beyond visual line of sight, but without managing the air traffic in a safe manner, it's this industry is not going to go too far.
Yeah, it's all about safety.
Yeah, it's all about safety. Absolutely. So let's talk about AirXos a little bit. I mean, I think I think it was the one name that nobody could say the first time they saw it written, and it was always kind of fun to listen to people try to pronounce AirXos. So tell us a little bit about the brand and the company and what it was like getting that project started up.
So yeah, so the name of the company was actually quite comical. The original name was just AIROS. But there was another company in the Wi-Fi space that had some firmware that had that trademarked. And so our lawyers at GE said, well, you can't trademark this. And I'm like, we can, but they weren't going to move forward with it. And our managing director at the time was Greek. And he said, put an X in the middle. The X is silent. And I said to him, 1% of the Earth's population is Greek. The X will not be silent. And sure enough, it was almost kind of comical to introduce the company, because everybody would start with can you tell me how to say the name? Great marketing, Yeah.
Well, it's actually a good icebreaker for conversations, but a little tough on spoken branding, I guess.
Yeah, for sure.
So you were recruited to join. GE had this vision for UTM. I mean, tell us a little bit about what that was like going to work for GE and I mean, big company. But in full disclosure, my grandfather worked for GE back in World War II when he just graduated from Purdue. And that's how he met my grandmother. And then he went off to war and unfortunately was KIA on a submarine. But so GE's probably responsible for me being here, in that it brought those two together in one way or another.
Yeah, I mean, massive company. And, I had predominantly worked in startups for probably the last 10 years or so. So it was a big change, but, we were in the ventures group, so a lot of innovation. And, the first kind of development of the company was really kind of focused in three areas. There was like small scale avionics. And that was really our tie into the bigger, broader GE Aviation. Then there was a waivers service to help develop some of these advanced operations. GE's customer base, if you think about the industrial side, all wants to get to automated robotics types of inspections and things like that. So we were trying to facilitate for the broader GE to help them get more advanced in their operations, scale their businesses, bring some cost reduction, things like that. And the third piece was UTM. And as long as we were under the venture side, a lot of that, we made a lot of inroads on that. The avionics side was a little bit challenging in that we were trying to do it based on some of our development, but leveraging the aviation side of GE and the avionics. And it's really hard for them to engineer the cost out at the scale that they develop things. And so we ended up putting the avionics piece to rest about 2 years into it. And we're really just focused on the advanced operations in UTM.
Okay. So I've worked at startups. It's a long struggle with user interfaces and developers and working with other partners. And obviously you had some integration with the FAA to make sure. I mean, can you tell us a little bit about what that's like? Because I think a lot of people here don't really kind of get that whole startup vibe and understand all the details that kind of come together when you're putting together a company like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's, look, starting a company is tough. We had this, we played to what we call play bigger. And play bigger was, always think about how you can deliver a service that's different than people are doing it today. And of course, UAS space, everything's kind of different. But the point of that is to say, how can we deliver something that's new and innovative when people think they need it a certain way, but you actually know how they should actually consume it. And part of the challenges of the UAS space, and I'll give you a really good example, is when you work with like utility companies, there are certain cyber requirements you have to meet from the NERC, but you also have to meet cyber requirements on the back end from the FAA. And so there's all these requirements from both the demand side and the supply side that you've got to marry. And then you've got to build that around mobile apps, web-based, PC-based apps. And then the third piece is you got to integrate some drones. Mm-hmm. And, at the time, a large percentage of the market was a specific manufacturer. So you had to essentially integrate to them. But we were really focused on bigger drones, flying 70-pound drones, 80-pound drones, doing some real hard work. And those drones weren't manufactured to integrate into a system. They were closed loop. And so there were a lot of challenges to broker relationships with those drone manufacturers to say, hey, like to get an API, get that connected to our platform. So that was still kind of ongoing work. I think the thing where AirXos probably really excelled was, working with public safety. And what we realized early on was that public safety was going to be probably the earliest adopters of drones. And the challenge they had was if there's an emergency, they've got to get flying. And as everybody in this industry knows, getting flying is the challenge, especially if you're overpopulation, ops over people. We've seen a bunch of legislation come out recently on that. But for law enforcement to fly, it's challenging. You got to fill out paperwork, all these things. And so we thought, well, how can we streamline that entire process? And so that's where we put a lot of focus was working with public safety, different state DOTs, law enforcement, fire departments, to help standardize some of their methods and procedures, and then build the automation in the front end so they didn't have to go fill out a piece of paper with a pen. They could essentially press a button and get flying. And automating things like SGI waivers, things like that were tremendous help for them.
Yeah, and I mean that's is the sweet spot, I think, because there is so much need there. I mean, we see still there's a big conflict between manned aviation and unmanned aviation, especially in public safety. And I get it. If you're a manned aviator with 15, 20, 30 years of experience, and you're physically in the aircraft flying around an incident scene, are you going to trust the guy who's a new Part 107 or a new public safety drone pilot down on the ground that he really knows what he's doing? And a lot of it's internal communications issues, but I think the ability to deconflict that through technology is one of the greatest opportunities both for public safety and regular enterprise operations. But the other problem is, and I think you may have seen this at AirXos a little bit, was just that the budgets aren't there right now on the public safety side. They're bootstrapping these programs together.
Yeah, so we had to obviously come in at a price point that would solve a lot of those problems. And so I think what we realized is, it's a very fragmented market. It's a very early stage market. And so we said, okay, how can we consolidate these capabilities so that we can give them a more streamlined process? And we saw things like asset management. In a way, it's kind of unfortunate that an agency buys a $2,500 drone or a $2,000 drone and has to put an asset tag and manage it. It really should be kind of a disposable asset, but they've got to manage it. That's part of being in an agency. So we facilitated, all of the management of those components within the application. Well, if they had to buy an asset tracking application and currency management piece for what they operated, then we could build all that into the application. So from the time they turned the app up to the time they quit flying, it was all captured. So we were able to solve multiple problems simultaneously and then save time.
And then COVID hits. Did COVID impact AirXos? And if so, tell us a little bit about how.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate. I mean, probably one of the largest areas of impact was on aviation. I mean, it shut down the airspace for a long time with people not traveling. And obviously we were in January of 19, we moved out of ventures and over into aviation. And when the impact to aviation came in, and remember, it was kind of a double whammy to aviation. We had the MAX 8, then we had COVID. So we'd already seen kind of like the winds of change coming in to say, hey, getting cash to keep the startup going is going to be a challenge. And it certainly impacted AirXos in that, GE basically said, the financial impact is too large from COVID, and we're no longer able to support funding for AirXos. So it was unfortunate. I think they're still working on doing something with the assets now, but it's really what led it. I stayed through, I think, November of last year, but when this opportunity at NuAir came up, it was too big an opportunity to just sit around and watch AirXos come apart. So.
Understood. So let's talk about that. So the opportunity at NuAir emerged. You had been working with NuAir in your capacity at Aeros. I mean, how did you kind of identify that this is the next move you wanted to make?
Sure. So I'd worked with NuAir for almost 4 years, going back to like 2017, and we've done a lot of work with them. And when the prior CEO left, I was like, wow, they've got all the assets to make this happen. And we had been working with a lot of different states to come up with kind of a public-private partnership model that when we work with the public safety, we could evolve into, once you're up and flying, you can now deploy infrastructure and have more operations going throughout the state. And that objective, I think, still is true today. Already reached out to all the states I was working with before to start putting together kind of a coalition. And I think the thing that's so unique about NuAir is you've got Syracuse Airport, Hancock International, that has had Reapers taking off next to commercial aircraft for years. You've got a test site, FAA authorized test site, and you've got a 50-mile corridor. And so the community there is open for drones. They're waiting for drones to come and deliver their packages, which is different than most cities around the United States that don't really want, or some people are mixed feelings about drones, I should say. And so when I looked at the demographics of the corridor, there's 750,000 people in that corridor. There,
Wow.
Almost 100 pharmacies. There's multiple distribution centers, and I said, there's pent up demand here. The industry wants to be able to do deliveries. They want to be able to do medical deliveries. You've got all the assets. You just need to commercialize this corridor. And so I reached out to them and said, hey, I'm very interested in this role. And it moved fairly quickly. The conversation was in October. I think, by November, we'd kind of come to an agreement. I was there by December. So
Wow. Yeah, that's fast.
yeah.
So for those out there who might not be specifically familiar with NuAir, I mean, how would you describe that to the layman out there?
Sure. So NuAir is a nonprofit funded by the state of New York to essentially, open the drone economy for the state of New York. How do we start utilizing drones in the state of New York? So enabling state agencies. So they were a partner of ours on the public safety front. They still, we now have what we call like an opportunity zone that we've set up with our state agencies that they can come to NuAir and we can facilitate waivers, things like that. Do they need methods and procedures training, things like that we help facilitate to get them up and flying. That also extends out to DOTs and Thruway and other agencies throughout the state, the Department of Environmental Conservation. But really the main goal is managing the test site, operating the test site on behalf of the FAA. And so, we just recently did the UPP there. And then we've got this piece now, the corridor.
So for those of you who are working your computer right now, Googling NuAir, we should point out it's spelled NuAir. And the URL is nuair.org or?
That's correct. Yeah. And there's no X.
No X. This one's easier. NuAir, NuAir. I want to ask about the corridor because I've traveled through upstate New York and the terrain there is a little more hilly and mountainous than a lot of people might realize. So, I mean, that 50-mile corridor, is it all flat or does it go through some of those hills and valleys? Like what kind of terrain are you dealing with?
Yeah, it's rolling hills. There's definitely undulation in the terrain for sure. But we've got, I think there's at least 6 radar systems that are dispersed over the whole 50-mile corridor. So we've got coverage and we've got all the history of every bit of air traffic that's gone through there for the last 3 years. So it's a great model for the safety case because we can build what the airspace environment, operating environment looks like. So it's a downtown area. Like I said, the population between Onondaga County and Oneida County, which are the 2 counties that kind of make up and surround Syracuse, are about 750,000 people. So there's a pretty sizable population up there as well.
So what kind of partners are you working with at NuAir, both within the corridor and some of the other projects you're working on?
Well, the timing for that question is great because we just pushed an RFI out on Friday. So we're, we have multiple partners. We have companies like Thales that we work with, AX Enterprises, a multitude of drone companies, USS companies, Andra Technologies. They've done work with AirXos. So we have a long list of partners. AIS, which is a cybersecurity company up there that we work with. But really, what we're trying to do now is really get a plug and play environment. Part of the challenge I mentioned earlier is integrating to all the various drones that are out there. And so we see, there's about 11 to 12 drones that are going through the type cert. We want to be able to have USS providers more than one that can say between the 2 or 3 or 4, however they can come up there, we can connect to 90% of the industry. And by doing that, and we'll have an RFI this quarter, we hope to get to RFP next quarter, that hopefully by the end of the year, we're getting to a place where the safety case for the beyond visual line of sight flights get far easier because we got type cert aircraft. We know what the airspace situational, operations look like. And we've got the capacity and the people to put those waivers together. And we're very much focused on what we call like local BV loss. We identify an area that sits over, say, like a retail outlet, or maybe even a local distribution center close enough to a major distribution center. And we start designing how we can get flights between those where they just run, nonstop. So it really is about getting commercialization and scale. And we really want to push, a model where everybody can come and essentially, participate, but also find a way to make money in this space. It's been a real struggle for UTMs or USS based companies to really make any hay in this space. A lot of R&D, a lot of it not paid for.
Yep. Yeah.
So we're trying to work through the economic models that everybody comes up and says, this is a sustainable model. We don't have to have daisy chain visual observers. It's really economically viable.
And are most of those operations focused on package or cargo delivery, or are they kind of a wide array of intelligence gathering, ISR?
So we have a lot of data already. I think what we're really looking at, the reason we're going to focus on package deliveries, like I said, we've got pent up demand. We saw some announcements from us earlier, working with some hospitals, upstate New York, and some other places that are saying, look, we're ready to do this now. And so I think we want to solve the demand that's there. But we also, it doesn't mean you take anything else off the plate. I mean, a lot of people sit and say, well, a CONOP for package delivery is very different than a CONOP for transmission distribution inspection. But the reality is the drone takes off, it flies around, and it lands. And so in that same space that we create those local BV loss envelopes, there's transmission lines, pipelines, there's other operations that we can run. And so just like in a wireless network, once you build the network, put as many operators as you can on there, safely, of course. That's really what we want to show, is that we can scale. And so we're hope, by the end of this year, we hope to have that up and running.
So where do you kind of see the industry in general coming? I mean, you've had a really interesting perspective. You've got the tech side. We talked a lot about the technology it's going to take for UTM to really operate successfully. But where do you see the hurdles right now and the key challenges that we need to overcome to really get to that next level?
Right. Well, I think a couple of things that just came out at the end of last year are really helpful. The fact that we have remote ID, even if it's not the perfect remote ID, we have something to start with. And we have rules now by which we can fly over people. So those two things are going to solve some issues. But I think the type cert aircraft is going to be really a tremendous leap for us in this industry, because, when you look at putting a safety case in front of the FAA, I think the first one we did for BV loss was about 900 pages.
Wow.
And you just can't afford to do that. And, it took us months to do it. And, you start with one flight, then you have two flights, it's just very time consuming. And so I think the aircraft will help along and a lot to get us further along. But I also think there's, I feel for Jay and team on the US integration side of the FAA, because I really see analogies to like my role at AirXos at GE. We would walk in and talk to the larger aviation company about what we're doing in the drone world, and they would look at us and be like, whatever.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that, Jay and his team are the innovators. They're the ones that are saying, look, we've got innovative ways to solve these things. And I think it's challenges organizing those changes across the broader FAA. And I'm hoping that we start seeing some changes there where they start to really put their arms around, and embrace what drones can do. And I think it's up to us to show them how to do it.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I kind of use that old analogy of when computers first started, home computers first started emerging, like personal computers, the computer clubs, and it was the geeks in the garages and in the high school gyms kind of getting together, because nobody really understood where this was going, and they were kind of scoffed at and laughed at. And there might be a little bit of that in the unmanned aviation world, albeit at a much more sophisticated level. But yeah, there's that friction between traditional manned aviation, not just the operators and the pilots, but the businesses who are used to making millions and billions of dollars from projects. And here we are, startup drone companies, in some cases happy with a couple $100,000 or just to be cash flow positive, whatever the case might be. What do you think we need to do as an industry to build more credibility in the eyes of traditional aviators?
So I think the industry is kind of doing that, to be honest with you. I think the industry's bent over backwards to get there. I think it really comes down to, can the regulatory agencies, can this administration really push the ball forward on this? I mean, my biggest fear is that, I've talked to some companies that have talked about moving to other countries because it's easier. And, I get that the US has the safest airspace in the world and nobody should ever stray from that. But my biggest fear of that is that once that technology leaves, that, we then wait for it to come back here. And we don't want that to happen. There's too many derivatives out of this that we as a nation really got to get behind, different types of hybrid electric, aircraft, hydrogen propulsion, all these different types of things that are going to emerge from the space, AI, all of these things are going to come together and create jobs and industry. And I think we really need the administration and the regulatory agencies really to lean forward. I think the people are here, the technology is ready. It's just, most regulatory agencies are reactive and they're not proactive. And I think that's probably the main challenge for us. I do think there's still some technology hurdles. For example, I talked about radar. There's other types of technologies that you can use for sense and avoid that we're starting to see emerge now that are much more cost effective. And I think, really understanding what those can do will really help benefit this industry and get us moving forward as well.
I know you spent time in DC. You've got a pretty good understanding of how the Beltway and inside the Beltway operates. I mean, what impact do you see the new administration having on the FAA and the industry in general? You think we're going to see any notable changes with Pete Buttigieg as the new Secretary of Transportation?
I feel like the conversation level has already had a major uptick in a very short amount of time. And I think that's all very good news for this space. And I haven't been engaged in those directly. I hope to start doing that. I'm still kind of getting my arms wrapped around what I'm doing here. But I think in the next 30, 60 days, we'll start engaging at that level. But I think we're already seeing more activity in the hallways there, more discussions. People are trying to push this forward. I mean, they see the value that this brings. I mean, it's interesting when you take recently did a lot of work and research on what the various DOTs have done in this space. And when you talk about the cost reduction, between using things like snooper trucks for bridge and inspections versus a drone, it's a $250,000 truck versus a $2,000, $20,000 drone. And post COVID, it's not like these states and cities have a lot of money, and they're going to have to look to ways to say, how do we save dollars? And I think those are the things that are going to really drive that. Is the economy is going to have some challenges post COVID. I mean, I think we all want to get there as fast as possible. I've been in the basement, I feel like, for 11 months now.
Yep.
But I think it's really critical that they start looking at different ways to get these things done and solve these problems that are far more cost effective.
So with the remaining minute or so, I want to talk a little bit again about NuAir and your RFI and how interested parties out there can learn more about NuAir and what the pathway you'd like them to follow to get in touch with your team to see how maybe they could work with you.
Sure. So, I have to say already, it's been a good response. I think we had, as of Wednesday of this week, over 15 companies that have responded. So that we thought was really healthy in a short amount of time. So I think, for us, it's, visit our website, nuair.org. All the information's out there. My phone, most people, I've talked to most of the people in this space for the last 4 years, so they can feel free to reach out to me anytime they want. My phone's connected to my hip, so it never goes off, so that's great. But I think, for those that feel like, we're focused on USS right now, just kind of watch what's going on and just think about, if you could come to a marketplace and say, how do I have my services meet the demand side, and have the supply side managed for me to access that. And I think that's really to watch. It's going to be. I always think about, when I think about UAS, is that you've got an agency that manages the airspace, which we say is supply side, and they're basically turning that over in some capacity to manage it, or management on behalf, to USSs. And so what the USSs have to really focus on is how do they tie that demand side, the people that want to access that airspace, into the supply side. And that's what we're really trying to facilitate, is how do we get those two marketplaces together, two sides of the marketplace together.
And therein lies another crux of the industry. And if we can solve that challenge, I think we'll all be in a much better place. Any final thoughts for the listeners out there before we wrap up?
No, I would just say that, we're open for business up here at NuAir. So if people are interested, we've got space at the airport. They can come up and put an office up if they want. They can deploy their software service, their capabilities. We want to talk to everybody out there in the marketplace to see what's happening out there.
All right. Our guest this week on Taming Disaster, Drones for Good, Ken Stewart. Ken, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it. And I hope you'll come back again real soon and update us on all the exciting things happening at NuAir.
I look forward to it. Thank you all so much. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks, everyone. And we'll see you next time on Taming Disaster, Drones for Good.
Thank you for listening to Taming Disaster, a production of AIRT, the world's leading nonprofit organization supporting drones for good. Learn more about us online at airt.ngo. And be sure to tune in to our public safety focused podcast, Drone Responders, hosted by Charles Werner.